"Stay down, you piece of trash," Officer Cassius hissed, his heavy steel-toed boot driving with sickening force into the ribs of the shackled man. The crowded courtroom gasped. Marius Ravensworth didn't scream. The highly decorated Navy SEAL merely absorbed the brutal kinetic impact, his iron chains rattling sharply against the polished oak floor. Slowly, deliberately, Marius lifted his head. His eyes, cold and obsidian, locked onto the smirking cop. "You just made the biggest mistake of your miserable life," Marius whispered, his dead calm voice cutting through the silence like a scalpel. Marius was a man carved from dark granite and lethal discipline, a Tier 1 elite operator who had survived the most unforgiving, blood-soaked environments on Earth. From the blistering, hostile sands of the Syrian desert to the freezing, black depths of the North Atlantic, during classified maritime interdictions, he had faced death and spat in its eye. Yet, here he was on domestic soil, stripped of his honorable uniform and his hard-earned trident. He was draped instead in the humiliating, oversized, aggressively bright orange jumpsuit of a county inmate. Heavy, rusted iron shackles bit mercilessly into his wrists and ankles, the cold metal chafing his dark skin raw with every breath. Standing directly over him, casting a long, dark shadow, was Officer Cassius. Cassius was a portrait of unearned arrogance and unchecked municipal power. He was a heavily built man whose entire sense of authority was derived not from moral character or physical courage, but entirely from the polished tin badge pinned to his swelling chest and the polymer-framed service weapon strapped to his hip. He chewed a piece of peppermint gum with lazy, open-mouthed insolence, his thumbs hooked casually into his utility belt. He genuinely, deeply enjoyed this. He thrived on the subjugation of men physically and morally greater than himself, feeding his own deep-seated insecurities by tearing down giants in a room where they were legally forbidden from fighting back. The kick had come completely out of nowhere, a vicious, cowardly, unprovoked strike designed specifically to shatter Marius's stoic composure in front of the watchful jury. Cassius's steel-toed tactical boot had connected perfectly with the soft tissue just beneath Marius's floating rib, a precise, cruel, calculated blow meant to steal the breath, puncture a lung, or at the very least, snap a bone and elicit a scream of pure agony. But Marius's brain was an impenetrable fortress, conditioned by years of brutal, mind-bending Bud-S training, Hell Week, and advanced, classified survival, evasion, resistance, and escape, SEER, interrogation protocols. His nervous system immediately compartmentalized the searing flash of pain. He did not flinch. He did not gasp. He did not cry out. He simply let the violent kinetic energy of the blow dissipate through his tightly coiled core. His breathing remained impeccably steady, engaging in tactical box breathing 4 seconds in, 4 seconds hold, 4 seconds out, keeping his heart rate controlled at a calm, icy 60 beats per minute. He knew exactly what this was. This was a crude, desperate psychological trap. Cassius wanted him to surge upward, to strain against the iron chains like a rabid animal, to bare his teeth and give the four-armed, jumpy bailiffs lining the courtroom walls an excuse to draw their weapons. Cassius wanted to end his life right there on the state seal, embedded in the floorboards, and call it self-defense. "Objection, Your Honor, what in God's name is happening in your courtroom?" The voice belonged to Bryn Montclair, Marius's defense attorney, and it cracked through the silent, shocked room like a sniper's high-velocity rifle. Bryn was a terrifying force of nature, a former military JAG lawyer turned civilian defense attorney who moved through the courtroom with the lethal, calculating grace of an apex predator. She slammed both hands down on the heavy oak defense table so hard her meticulously organized file scattered, her emerald eyes blazing with absolute, unadulterated fury as she pointed a trembling, accusatory finger directly at Cassius. "That officer just blatantly and maliciously assaulted my shackled client in plain view of the bench, the jury, and God. I demand he be held in criminal contempt, stripped of his badge and weapon, and arrested immediately by the bailiffs." High above them, perched like a vulture on his elevated wooden throne, Judge Sterling peered over his wire-rimmed reading glasses. Sterling was an institution of the city's corrupt old guard, a man whose wooden gavel was heavily weighted by the invisible, blood-stained hands of the city's wealthy elite. He let out a long, theatrical, exasperated sigh, entirely unbothered by the blatant display of police brutality that had just occurred 3 feet from his podium. He adjusted his heavy black robes, looking vastly more annoyed by Bryn's volume than by Cassius's sudden violence. "Settle down, Miss Montclair. Lower your voice in my courtroom instantly," Judge Sterling drawled, his voice a gravelly, aristocratic monotone, dripping with condescension and predetermined bias. From my elevated vantage point, the defendant was making sudden, unpredictable, and highly aggressive movements. Officer Cassius was merely acting preemptively, subduing a potentially dangerous, highly trained individual before he could become a physical threat to the officers of this court. Need I remind you, counselor, of your client's lethal background? He is, by his own admission, a weapon of war. He was shifting his weight because his ankles are actively bleeding from the improperly applied shackles. Bryn fired back, her voice echoing off the high, vaulted plaster ceilings, absolutely refusing to yield an inch of ground. "This is a gross, actionable violation of his Eighth Amendment rights, and I want it explicitly on the official record that this court is actively, willingly turning a blind eye to outright, malicious felony battery. Your objection is noted for the record, counselor. Now, instruct your client to remain perfectly still like a civilized human being, or I will have him restrained further," Sterling commanded, banging his gavel once with a dull, dismissive, final thud. "Next outburst, from you, Miss Montclair, and I'll have you joining him in a holding cell for contempt." Marius slowly brought his gaze up from the scuffed wood of the floor, bypassing Cassius entirely to look directly at Bryn. He gave her a microscopic, almost imperceptible nod. "Hold the line," the look communicated through years of nonverbal battlefield shorthand. "Let them play their arrogant, rigged game. The ambush is set." Seeing that his physical assault had completely failed to provoke a violent reaction, Cassius grew visibly frustrated, his face flushed an ugly, mottled red. He leaned in incredibly close, dropping to one knee so his face was mere inches from Marius's ear. His breath smelled foul, a mixture of stale black coffee, artificial peppermint, and cheap chewing tobacco. "See that, hero?" Cassius whispered, his voice a venomous, vibrating hiss meant only for Marius's ears, entirely bypassing the sensitive court microphones. "Nobody in this city cares about your shiny little combat medals. You're nothing but a street thug in an orange suit to them. I own this town. I own this judge. I own you. And when Sterling puts you away for 20 years at the state penitentiary, I'm going to make a very special, very personal late-night visit to your sweet little sister's bakery. I hear she works all alone in the dark. Be a damn shame if something aggressive happened to her while you were rotting in a cell." A dangerous, icy calm washed over Marius, extinguishing the absolute last remnants of his civilian restraint. The direct, violent mention of his younger sister, Kiara, flipped a heavy, locked switch deep within the darkest, most lethal recesses of his psyche. The passive survival instinct of a cornered man vanished instantly, entirely replaced by the chilling, calculating, hyper-lethal machinery of a Tier 1 master tactician. Cassius thought he was breaking a stubborn civilian. The corrupt cop didn't realize he had just declared total, scorched earth warfare on a ghost who specialized in dismantling enemies piece by bloody piece in the dark. Marius didn't yell. He didn't struggle against the heavy iron binding him. He simply turned his head slightly, looked up into Cassius's mocking, arrogant eyes, and delivered his promise with a voice that sounded like grinding tectonic plates soft, but carrying the weight of an earthquake. "You just made the biggest mistake of your miserable life." Cassius tried to scoff, attempting to maintain his fragile facade of superiority, but a fleeting, undeniable shadow of primal unease flickered rapidly behind his eyes. He backed away slightly, nervously readjusting his heavy leather duty belt, trying desperately to shake off the sudden, inexplicable chill that had just crawled up his spine and settled in the base of his neck. The predator thought he had trapped a helpless sheep in a cage, utterly and fatally blind to the alpha wolf that was now quietly, patiently studying his throat. To truly comprehend the sheer, staggering magnitude of the injustice currently unfolding in Judge Sterling's corrupt courtroom, one had to look back exactly 3 weeks to a miserable, rain-slicked Tuesday night in the rapidly gentrifying, highly affluent neighborhood of Oak Creek. Marius had just returned home from a grueling, highly classified 9-month deployment in the volatile South China Sea. His body was battered from relentless maritime operations, but his spirit was profoundly lifted by the prospect of family and civilian peace. He had spent his very first night back on American soil covered in paint, helping his younger sister Kiara renovate the interior of her newly purchased bakery. It was her lifelong, desperate dream, funded almost entirely by Marius's accumulated hazardous duty pay, combat bonuses, and years of saving every dime. Oak Creek, however, was not a free market. It was the exclusive, fiercely protected, monopolized domain of Theodora Montrose. Theodora was a ruthless, multi-billionaire real estate magnate who ruled the city's urban development board with an iron fist, an army of obscenely expensive corporate lawyers, and an open, untraceable checkbook. Theodora had grand, billion-dollar designs for a massive, luxury waterfront casino and retail complex, and she desperately needed the specific, historic corner lot Kiara had legally purchased at a city auction 6 months prior. When Kiara politely but firmly refused a lowball cash offer to sell the building to one of Theodora's anonymous shell companies, Theodora decided to simply crush the minor inconvenience. She didn't bother utilizing her legal team for eminent domain. It took too long. Instead, she used the city police force she heavily subsidized through dark money union donations and political action committees. She unleashed her favorite, most reliable attack dog, Officer Cassius. As Marius had driven home that night in his modest, meticulously maintained 10-year-old sedan, the blinding, strobing red and blue lights had suddenly appeared in his rearview mirror. It happened on a deserted, notoriously unlit stretch of the industrial district, a place explicitly known for having malfunctioning city surveillance cameras. Cassius had pulled him over for a supposedly broken passenger side taillight, a taillight that Cassius himself had violently smashed with the heavy, steel butt of his tactical flashlight while Marius was safely leaning over to retrieve his registration and insurance from the glove box. What followed in the pouring rain was a terrifying masterclass in municipal corruption. Cassius, loudly and aggressively claiming to his body camera that he smelled the distinct, overwhelming odor of contraband narcotics, had ordered Marius out of the car at gunpoint. Knowing full well that any sudden movement, any sign of resistance, would result in his immediate execution under the guise of officer safety, Marius complied perfectly. He moved with slow, deliberate precision, interlacing his fingers behind his head. By the time 2 heavily armed backup cruisers arrived, sliding in the wet asphalt, a completely stolen, unregistered 9mm Glock pistol with a heavily filed-off serial number, and 3 tightly wrapped ounces of pure, cartel-grade narcotics had miraculously materialized under the passenger seat of Marius's spotless car. The trap was sprung perfectly, the narrative written before Marius was even placed in the back of the cruiser. Now, sitting in the crowded, tense gallery of the courtroom, Kiara clutched a damp, shredded tissue in her hands. Her large brown eyes were red, swollen, and filled with a deep, existential terror she couldn't articulate. She was a brilliant pastry chef, a gentle, nurturing soul completely unequipped for the vicious, predatory nature of the criminal justice system. Seeing her older brother, the stoic, unshakable man who had carried her on his shoulders, when their parents died in a tragic car crash, the man who had bled for his country in places she couldn't pronounce, shackled and violently beaten by a smirking cop, was actively breaking her spirit piece by piece. But Kiara wasn't the only one watching the proceedings with intense, vested interest. 3 rows directly behind her, partially obscured by the heavy shadows of the grand oak double doors at the back of the courtroom, sat Callista. Dressed impeccably in a sharp, slate-gray tailored suit, Callista was an elite, senior investigator for the state's notoriously secretive Internal Affairs Division, specifically attached to a joint federal anti-corruption task force. She had been quietly, obsessively tracking Cassius and his precinct for 8 agonizing months. Her highly classified, encrypted files showed a terrifying, undeniable pattern. Thousands in cartel cash missing from evidence lockups, over 24 excessive force complaints miraculously vanishing from the internal database, and an inexplicable, steady influx of cryptocurrency into Cassius's offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. Callista had watched the unprovoked kick. She had watched Judge Sterling's blatant, illegal dismissal of the assault. Her pen flew furiously across her yellow legal pad, documenting every breath, every micro-expression, every biased word spoken on the record. She knew Cassius was incredibly dirty, but proving it in a town completely owned, operated, and funded by Theodora Montrose was like trying to drain the ocean with a cracked teacup. Directly next to Callista, radiating a frantic, nervous, erratic energy that vibrated through the wooden pew, sat Marina. Marina was Theodora Montrose's personal executive assistant, chief of staff, and primary fixer. She was a woman who had comfortably lived her entire adult life in the moral gray areas, executing Theodora's ruthless corporate orders with sterile, sociopathic efficiency. She had ruined promising careers, bankrupted stubborn small business owners, and buried horrific public relations scandals for a massive six-figure salary, stock options, and a penthouse apartment. But maliciously setting up a highly decorated, black combat veteran, a man who had saved lives just to steal his little sister's bakery for a casino parking lot, had inexplicably crossed a deeply buried, long-forgotten moral line. Even Marina's hardened, calloused conscience struggled to swallow this specific poison. Marina had been the one to process the untraceable digital payment to Cassius's offshore account the night of the arrest. She had the digital footprint. She held the encrypted receipts. And lately, the suffocating, crushing guilt had been keeping her awake, staring at her vaulted ceiling until dawn, wondering at what exact moment she had traded her human soul for a corner office and a platinum corporate credit card. She gripped her designer leather handbag tightly on her lap, her knuckles white, knowing that inside lay a small, black, encrypted flash drive. That drive contained the financial ledgers, the recorded phone calls, and the emails that could either save Marius Ravensworth and burn Theodora's empire to ash, or get Marina permanently buried in the wet concrete foundation of Theodora's new high-rise. Back at the defense table, Bryn was furiously organizing her meticulously tabbed notes, her mind operating at light speed. The prosecution's case against Marius was, on paper, superficially flawless. Cassius's body-worn camera had mysteriously and conveniently malfunctioned due to a battery short during the exact 2-minute window. The weapon and contraband were allegedly found. It was a highly convenient technical glitch that Judge Sterling had already ruled perfectly admissible, citing known manufacturer defects. The arresting reports were airtight, seamlessly corroborated by 2 other patrol officers who were firmly and profitably in Cassius's pocket. "Marius, look at me," Bryn whispered, leaning so close that her dark hair brushed his broad shoulder, ensuring the highly sensitive courtroom microphones wouldn't pick up a single syllable of her voice. "I know exactly what he just did to you. I know every fiber of your being wants to snap his neck right here in front of God, the jury, and the press. But we need to play the long, agonizing game. If you strike back physically, you prove their racist, violent narrative right. You give them the legal justification to bury you under the jail. We don't fight him with our hands. We dismantle him on the stand. We strip him of his armor, piece by piece, and we make him bleed out in the public transcript for the federal observers to see." Marius adjusted his rigid posture, the heavy iron chains clinking softly, a sound that seemed to echo ominously in the large, tense room. The sharp, stabbing pain in his ribs was a dull, throbbing reminder of his new, absolute objective. "I don't just want him dismantled, Bryn," Marius murmured, his voice a low, terrifyingly calm, gravelly hum that sent a sudden shiver down her spine. "I want the whole rotten house burned down to the bedrock. Cassius is just the dumb weapon. He's the trigger man. Someone with incredibly deep pockets paid him to pull it. I want them all exposed, and I want them all to pay." Bryn met his gaze, feeling the sheer, unadulterated willpower and tactical brilliance radiating from him. She knew he wasn't just planning a legal defense, he was planning a devastating counteroffensive. "Then, let's start lighting the matches," she said, standing up sharply and buttoning her tailored blazer. She looked toward the bench, her voice ringing out clear, powerful, and utterly unafraid. The defense calls Officer Cassius to the stand. Officer Cassius swaggered from the prosecution table to the witness stand like a conquering Roman general taking his rightful throne. He raised his right hand, placed his left on the worn courtroom Bible, and swore to tell the truth with a practiced, solemn, and deeply fake expression of civic duty that made Bryn physically nauseous. He then settled his considerable bulk into the creaking leather witness chair, shooting a smug, victorious, deeply arrogant look toward the prosecution table. There, a young, sweating assistant district attorney sat, looking hopelessly out of his depth, acting merely as a bureaucratic rubber stamp for the police department's agenda. Bryn approached the wooden podium slowly, deliberately, the click of her heels echoing like a metronome in the dead silent room. She didn't carry a yellow legal notepad. She didn't bring any thick manila case files. She simply leaned against the heavy wood of the podium and stared at Cassius. She held the silence for a long, agonizing, incredibly uncomfortable 20 seconds. In the stretching void, the courtroom's collective breathing seemed to halt. The jury shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes darting between the lawyer and the cop. Marius sat perfectly still, his eyes acting as advanced, hyper-focused thermal optics, reading every micro-expression and physiological tell on Cassius's flushed face. The slight, rapid flare of the nostrils as he breathed, the violent tightening of the left masseter muscle in his jaw, the subtle, nervous tapping of his thick index finger on the wooden armrest. Cassius was highly confident in the lies he had rehearsed, but he severely lacked emotional discipline under the crushing weight of silent pressure. Officer Cassius, Bryn finally began, her voice soft, almost conversational, a stark, jarring contrast to her earlier shouting match with the judge. You testified under direct examination by the state that you pulled Mr. Ravensworth over at exactly 11:42 p.m. due to a severely broken passenger side taillight. Is that correct? That is exactly correct, ma'am, Cassius said, leaning aggressively into the microphone, his voice booming through the speakers. And you confidently stated, under oath, that upon approaching the vehicle, Mr. Ravensworth was immediately hostile, highly combative, verbally abusive, and suddenly reached toward the dark floorboards, prompting you to draw your service weapon in fear for your life. Yes, counselor. I feared for my life, and the lives of the citizens I protect. My extensive department training took over. In this city, you simply can't take chances with suspects who exhibit aggressive, non-compliant, erratic behavior. Of course it did. Training is paramount, Bryn replied, her tone dripping with a heavy, weaponized, mocking sympathy. And it was only after you bravely secured him in rigid handcuffs, placed him in the pouring rain, and waited for backup that you conducted a search of the vehicle. And lo and behold, you miraculously found an unregistered firearm and a significant quantity of narcotics? It was a standard, by-the-book inventory search incident to a lawful, on-site arrest, Cassius replied smoothly. He had rehearsed this exact script 100 times in the precinct locker room with his union rep. Bryn nodded slowly, stepping away from the podium and beginning a slow, predatory pace back and forth in front of the jury box. Now, officer, you also explicitly noted in your official, sworn incident report that your body-worn camera suffered a catastrophic, unexplainable battery failure at exactly 11:45 p.m. conveniently right before you discovered the illegal evidence. And then, it miraculously powered back on at 11:48 p.m., once the evidence was safely secured in an evidence bag on the hood of your cruiser. Quite the spectacular, perfectly timed technological anomaly. Police equipment fails, counselor. We buy from the lowest government bidder. I can't control the hardware, I just wear it, Cassius smirked, glancing up at Judge Sterling, who offered a subtle, validating nod of agreement to the jury. Indeed, equipment fails, but forensic science rarely does, Bryn said, stopping dead in her tracks directly in front of Cassius. The softness in her voice vanished entirely, replaced by a razor-sharp, lethal edge. She turned sharply toward the bench. Your Honor, at this time, the defense would like to introduce Defense Exhibit G into evidence. The young prosecutor shot out of his chair as if he had been physically spring-loaded. Objection. Objection, Your Honor. This is outrageous. We have absolutely no Exhibit G in our discovery files. The defense is attempting a trial by ambush. Because I only received it at exactly 6 a.m. this morning via heavily encrypted, anonymous federal courier, Bryn stated loudly, her voice booming, her eyes locked mercilessly on Cassius. It is a highly relevant, deeply disturbing piece of physical and digital evidence that directly, unequivocally, and scientifically contradicts the sworn, perjured testimony of this corrupt officer. Judge Sterling scowled deeply, his thick gray eyebrows knitting together in genuine anger. He gripped his gavel tightly. I'll allow it conditionally, but this better not be a frivolous, theatrical waste of the court's time, Miss Montclair, or I swear I will hold you in contempt and declare a mistrial. Bryn didn't blink. She signaled her paralegal, who quickly connected a high-end tablet to the courtroom's AV system. The large monitors facing the jury flared to life. Officer Cassius, let's talk about the weapon you claim you found. You stated it was an unregistered, untraceable street weapon with a filed-off serial number. A ghost gun commonly used by cartels. That is correct. My client, Mr. Ravensworth, is a highly specialized weapons expert. While he was being illegally detained, he noticed a very specific, tiny armorer's stamp on the slide of that weapon, a stamp invisible to the naked eye unless you know exactly what to look for. Exhibit G is a sworn forensic report from an independent ballistic laboratory commissioned by a federal task force. Cassius's face twitched. The smirk completely vanished. This report, Bryn continued, projecting her voice to the back rows, proves conclusively through firing pin microstamping that the weapon you supposedly found under my client's seat was actually an impounded weapon. Specifically, it was impounded 3 years ago in your very own precinct, logged into your evidence locker, and was supposed to be destroyed. It was signed out 2 days before my client's arrest by an officer using a fake badge number. But the IP address used to log into the terminal traces back to your personal desk. Pandemonium began to bubble in the gallery. The prosecutor stared at his desk, realizing his career was imploding. Clerical error. Cassius stammered, gripping the edges of his seat, his knuckles turning white. The system gets hacked. That proves nothing. I thought you might say that. Bryn smiled a cold, terrifying smile. Which brings us to the second part of Exhibit G. You are fully aware that while your department-issued body camera might mysteriously fail, the modern police cruiser's dashboard camera operates on a completely independent, hardwired, tamper-proof system that syncs directly and continuously to a secure, off-site state cloud server, correct? Cassius's jaw tightened visibly. The smug, arrogant smile began to melt away, rapidly replaced by a rigid, wide-eyed, primal wariness. Yes. But my cruiser's dashcam was flagged as totally inoperable that night by the motor pool mechanic. It was completely dead. That's exactly what the falsified motor pool log says. Yes, Bryn agreed cheerfully. However, a highly concerned citizen, a whistleblower with top-tier administrative access to Theodora Montrose's shell corporations, and the city's independent IT contractor managed to retrieve the deleted cloud backup before it could be permanently, manually scrubbed. In the gallery, Marina lowered her head, hiding her pale, terrified face behind a curtain of dark hair. She squeezed her eyes shut, terrified of the massive corporate and criminal consequences, but a profound, overwhelming sense of relief washed over her. Callista, sitting nearby, noticed Marina's visceral reaction. Callista's eyes narrowed, connecting the dots instantly. She reached into her blazer and subtly unclasped the holster of her federal badge. Let's play the unedited audio, shall we? Bryn said, pressing a button on a remote. The high-fidelity courtroom speakers crackled to life. The heavy, rhythmic, undeniable sound of rain pounding against a police cruiser windshield filled the silent room. Then, a voice, unmistakably, undeniably Cassius's voice, echoing in the chamber of justice. Yeah, I got him, just like the boss lady wanted. Perfect location, no cameras, no witnesses on this stretch of Oak Creek. Another voice chimed in, nervous, hesitant, and young. A responding rookie officer. You sure about this, Cass? I ran the plates. Guy's got a military tag. Says he's a SEAL. This feels really bad, man. Cassius's recorded voice laughed a cruel, arrogant, horrific sound. "I don't care if he's Captain America. Theodora wants the sister's bakery property by Friday, and putting her hero brother in a cage for 20 years is how we leverage her to sign the deed over. Hand me the drop piece from the locker. Make sure you wipe your prints off the grip. Oh, and call the warden at county. Tell him we're bringing in a resistor. Have a few of the boys ready to rough him up in holding before his arraignment. Make it look like he fell down the concrete stairs." A collective, horrified, deafening gasp echoed through the gallery. Total pandemonium erupted. Reporters in the back rows frantically began typing on their phones, sensing a national scandal. The prosecutor dropped his expensive pen, his mouth hanging open in pure, unadulterated shock. Judge Sterling's face instantly drained of all color, his gavel frozen in midair, realizing his entire corrupt fiefdom was crumbling in real time. On the witness stand, Cassius sat entirely paralyzed. His eyes were blown wide with sheer, inescapable terror. All the blood rushed from his face, leaving him a sickening shade of gray. He looked exactly like a man who had just carelessly stepped on a tripwire and heard the fatal click. Marius leaned forward, the heavy iron chains clinking softly in the sudden, deafening, heavy silence of the shocked courtroom. He didn't gloat. He didn't shout in triumph. He simply looked deep into Cassius's terrified, trembling eyes and offered a slow, chilling, utterly predatory smile that promised absolute, inescapable ruin. For 3 agonizing, breathless seconds, the audio recording hung in the stale courtroom air like the lingering smoke of a detonated grenade. Then, the absolute chaos of complete systemic collapse took over. The gallery erupted into a deafening roar. Cell phone cameras, previously hidden against court rules, were suddenly hoisted into the air, their digital flashes strobing like a violent lightning storm. Reporters scrambled over the wooden pews, shouting frantic questions, shoving microphones toward the barricade. The young, completely out of his depth assistant district attorney threw his hands in the air, frantically backpedaling away from the prosecution table as if it were coated in radioactive waste. He ripped off his expensive silk tie, loudly declaring to anyone who would listen that he was formally withdrawing from the case and immediately resigning from the district attorney's office. High atop his elevated wooden throne, Judge Sterling was having a full-blown panic attack masquerading as judicial authority. His face, normally a mask of arrogant, aristocratic boredom, was now a sickly, mottled purple. He pounded his wooden gavel with a frantic, desperate rhythm, the loud thwack thwack thwack, completely drowned out by the sheer volume of the rioting room. "Order! I demand order in my court!" Sterling shrieked, his voice cracking, entirely devoid of its usual gravelly menace. "Bailiffs, clear the gallery. Miss Montclair, you are entirely out of order. This so-called evidence is unverified, illegally obtained, and entirely inadmissible. Strike it from the record immediately. I am holding you in direct, criminal contempt." Bryn Montclair didn't flinch. She stood her ground at the podium, her posture as rigid and unyielding as tempered steel. She looked up at the sweating, panicked judge with a gaze of absolute, chilling defiance. "You can't strike the truth, Your Honor. The jury has heard it. The press has recorded it. And more importantly, the federal government has been securely copied on the original, uncorrupted files." On the witness stand, Officer Cassius finally snapped out of his terrified paralysis. The primal, rat-like survival instinct of a cornered criminal kicked in. Realizing that his badge, his freedom, and likely his life were entirely forfeit if he stayed in that chair, he lunged upward. His large, meaty hand instinctively dropped toward the polymer grip of his holstered service weapon. It was a stupid, desperate, entirely suicidal reflex. The action of a man who had relied on violence to solve every problem in his miserable life. "He's reaching," Bryn shouted, stepping back from the podium. Before Cassius could even unclip the retention strap of his holster, the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom burst open with a deafening crash. "Federal agents, nobody move. Hands in the air, right now." Callista, the sharply dressed internal affairs investigator who had been sitting quietly in the shadows, was suddenly standing in the center aisle. She was no longer a passive observer. In her right hand, she held a compact, matte black Sig Sauer, trained flawlessly on Cassius's center mass. In her left hand, she held up a gold federal badge that glinted under the harsh fluorescent lights. Flanking her were 6 heavily armored FBI tactical agents, their assault rifles raised, establishing immediate, overwhelming dominance over the room. "Officer Cassius, take your hand off that weapon slowly, or you will be neutralized where you stand," Callista ordered, her voice cutting through the pandemonium with absolute, icy authority. "You are under arrest by the Federal Bureau of Investigation for civil rights violations, evidence tampering, perjury, and racketeering." Cassius froze, his hand hovering inches from his gun. He looked at the laser sights painting his chest, then at Callista's unwavering, lethal gaze. Slowly, trembling uncontrollably, he raised his hands. 2 tactical agents surged forward, violently yanking him out of the witness box. They slammed him face first against the polished mahogany paneling of the judge's bench. The sound of heavy steel ratcheting tight around Cassius's wrists echoed beautifully in the room. They didn't use the standard, padded police cuffs. They used heavy, unforgiving federal iron. They immediately stripped him of his gun belt, his radio, and ripped the tin badge right off his chest, tossing it unceremoniously onto the floor. "What is the meaning of this outrage?" Judge Sterling bellowed, spittle flying from his lips as he stood up, pointing a shaking finger at Callista. "You have absolutely no jurisdiction in my state courtroom. I am the supreme authority here. I demand you release that officer and vacate my premises immediately." Callista calmly holstered her weapon and walked slowly toward the bench, her heels clicking methodically on the hardwood floor. She stopped directly in front of Sterling's elevated podium, looking up at him not with respect, but with absolute, surgical disgust. "Judge Arthur Sterling," Callista said, reaching into the inner pocket of her tailored blazer and producing a thick, folded stack of heavily stamped legal documents. "This is a sealed federal warrant signed by a United States District Judge. It authorizes the immediate search and seizure of your chambers, your private residence, and your offshore bank accounts in the Cayman Islands. You are hereby under arrest for judicial corruption, accepting massive, undocumented bribes from Theodora Montrose, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit malicious prosecution." Sterling's mouth opened, but no sound came out. His gavel slipped from his sweaty, trembling fingers, bouncing off his desk and clattering to the floor right next to Cassius's discarded badge. The supreme authority of Oak Creek had just been entirely visually and legally castrated in front of the world. 2 more federal agents stepped up to the bench, grabbing the judge by his expensive silk robes and hauling him down from his throne to be handcuffed. Amidst the absolute destruction of the corrupt establishment, Marius Ravensworth remained perfectly still. He slowly turned his head, his obsidian eyes locking onto the weeping, terrified form of Cassius, who was now being dragged out of the courtroom by his collar. Marius didn't smile. He simply gave Cassius the exact same, microscopic nod of acknowledgement he had given Bryn earlier. The message was clear: "I told you so." 3 miles away from the chaos of the courthouse, completely insulated in a world of obscene, untouchable wealth, Theodora Montrose stood before the massive, floor-to-ceiling windows of her penthouse office. The sprawling city of Oak Creek was laid out beneath her expensive designer heels like a vast, conquerable game board. She sipped a glass of vintage, perfectly chilled champagne, wholly unaware that the foundation of her multi-billion-dollar empire was rapidly disintegrating into dust. Theodora was a woman forged in the fires of cutthroat corporate espionage. She possessed cold, calculating, serpentine features, her silver hair pulled back into a severe, unforgiving knot. She didn't view people as human beings. She viewed them as leverage, obstacles, or stepping stones. Marius Ravensworth and his sister, Kiara, were nothing more than a minor zoning nuisance, a tiny gnat that needed to be crushed so she could break ground on her new, highly lucrative waterfront casino. Cassius was merely the expensive, blunt instrument she had hired to do the crushing. The heavy, soundproof oak doors of her office suddenly burst open, entirely shattering her pristine, quiet solitude. Her massive, heavily scarred head of private corporate security, a former mercenary named Vance, stormed into the room. He didn't bother knocking. His face was pale, his tablet clutched tightly in his massive hands. Miss Montrose, we have a catastrophic situation, Vance said, his voice entirely devoid of its usual calm, menacing demeanor. The Ravensworth trial. It just completely blew up. Someone leaked the deleted police dashcam audio to the defense. Cassius is fully exposed. The feds just raided the courtroom. They arrested Cassius on the stand, and they just handcuffed Judge Sterling. Theodora froze, the delicate crystal champagne flute pausing an inch from her thin lips. A cold, sharp shard of pure panic pierced through her arrogant exterior. That's completely impossible, she hissed, her voice dropping an octave into a lethal whisper. Cassius assured me his technical guys scrubbed the cloud servers, and Sterling is strictly on my payroll. He wouldn't allow a federal ambush in his own courtroom. It happened live on the public feed, ma'am, Vance said, bringing up the video on his tablet and placing it on her massive, polished mahogany desk. And it gets infinitely worse. The leak didn't come from a random hacker. The encryption signatures on the audio file match our own internal, highly secure corporate servers. Someone inside this building bypassed the firewalls and handed the feds the smoking gun. Theodora's blood ran completely cold. There were exactly 2 people on the entire planet who possessed the highest-level administrative clearance to access those specific, deeply buried ghost files: herself and her executive assistant, Marina. "Where is Marina?" Theodora demanded, her voice suddenly shrill, slamming her champagne glass down on the desk so hard the delicate crystal stem violently shattered, slicing open her index finger. She didn't even notice the blood pooling on the polished wood. She didn't show up for her shift this morning. Her corporate keycard hasn't pinged the garage, Vance replied, stepping back. "Ma'am, we need to initiate the Alpha Burn protocol immediately. We need to physically destroy the hard drives and get you on the private jet to a non-extradition country. The FBI will be here in less than 10 minutes. Do it." "Burn the servers," Theodora barked, rushing behind her desk and ripping open her secure, biometric laptop. "I need to move the offshore slush funds. If they freeze my primary accounts, I need the Cayman money to secure international counsel and buy a new identity." She quickly pressed her bleeding thumb against the biometric scanner and typed in her massive, 64-character decryption password. The screen loaded into her private, deeply hidden offshore banking portal. She navigated to the master account holding over $300 million in untraceable liquid corporate assets. She hit transfer. A bright red, flashing error box popped up on the screen. "Access denied, insufficient funds. Current balance, $0. No, 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 no," Theodora whispered, her fingers flying across the keyboard in a frantic, desperate blur. Checking her secondary accounts, her cryptocurrency wallets, her shell company holdings, every single account was completely, utterly drained, zeroed out. Suddenly, a small, highly encrypted video file popped up on her desktop. It was titled "Severance Package." With a trembling, bloody finger, Theodora clicked it. The video opened to show Marina sitting in a sterile white room. The quiet, obedient, perpetually terrified assistant looked completely different. She looked calm. She looked finally, entirely free. "Hello, Theodora," Marina said in the video, her voice steady and resolute. "If you're watching this, the feds have Cassius, and you are trying to flee. You pushed too far this time. Setting up a decorated war hero to steal a bakery? That was the line. I drained your offshore accounts this morning. The funds have been permanently wired to a secure federal holding trust, earmarked as restitution for the victims of your corrupt development schemes. The encryption keys are securely with the FBI. You have absolutely nothing left. You're broke, Theodora. And the feds are already in the elevator." The video cut to black. Theodora Montrose, the untouchable queen of Oak Creek, stared at her own terrified reflection in the dark monitor. Her empire hadn't just been dismantled, it had been completely, aggressively vaporized by the very woman who used to fetch her coffee. Seconds later, the sound of heavy tactical boots and a battering ram echoed violently down the penthouse hallway. Back in the secure, subterranean bowels of the municipal courthouse, the heavy, oppressive atmosphere had entirely shifted. The holding area, normally a place of despair, echoed with the crisp, efficient commands of federal agents processing a massive, systemic takedown. In a small, private interview room, the heavy, rusted iron shackles binding Marius Ravensworth's wrists and ankles were finally unlocked. The heavy metal fell to the concrete floor with a loud, incredibly satisfying clatter. A federal marshal respectfully handed Marius his civilian clothes, a crisp white shirt and dark jeans. As Marius changed out of the humiliating orange jumpsuit, the door creaked open, and Bryn walked in, accompanied by Kiara. Kiara didn't say a word. She simply sprinted across the small room and threw her arms around her older brother's neck, burying her face in his chest, sobbing uncontrollably. This time, however, they were tears of profound, overwhelming relief. Marius wrapped his massive arms around her, kissing the top of her head. For the very first time since the violent arrest in the rain, the lethal, cold, calculating Tier 1 operator vanished, entirely replaced by the deeply protective, loving older brother. "It's over, Kiki," Marius whispered, his gravelly voice surprisingly gentle, smoothing her hair. "The bakery is safe. You're safe. I promised you." Bryn leaned against the doorframe, a weary but immensely satisfied smile playing on her lips. The federal prosecutor just officially signed the complete exoneration paperwork, Marius. All state charges are formally dropped with extreme prejudice. You are a completely free man. And the ACLU is already drafting a civil suit against the city that will ensure Kiara never has to take out a business loan ever again. "What about Cassius?" Marius asked, his dark eyes shifting back to Bryn, the lethal edge instantly returning to his voice. Forgiveness was not in his tactical manual. "He's in a secure federal holding cell down the hall," Callista said, stepping into the room behind Bryn. "He's completely singing. He's offering to give up every dirty cop in the precinct, Judge Sterling and Theodora Montrose, in exchange for federal protection and a reduced sentence. The rat is desperately trying to save a sinking ship." Marius gently pulled away from Kiara, his jaw setting into a hard, unforgiving line. "I need to see him, just for 1 minute. No violence, just a conversation." Callista hesitated, looking at Bryn, then nodded slowly. "Technically, you're a cleared civilian victim now. I'll allow it. But I'm standing right beside you." 2 minutes later, Marius stood before the reinforced, shatterproof glass of holding cell 4. Inside, Cassius sat on a rigid metal bench. He was stripped of his uniform, draped in the exact same humiliating orange jumpsuit he had forced Marius to wear just hours earlier. He looked completely pathetic, a deflated, terrified, sweating shell of the arrogant predator who had kicked Marius in the ribs. Cassius looked up, flinching violently when he saw Marius's cold, obsidian eyes staring at him through the glass. Cassius stood up, rushing to the glass, speaking through the small, metal intercom grate. "Ravensworth, look, man to man. I was just following orders. It wasn't personal," Cassius pleaded, his voice a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "Theodora had me by the throat. You won. Okay? You're free. I'm giving the feds everything. I'll testify against her. Just tell them to put me in protective custody, please." Marius didn't blink. He leaned incredibly close to the glass, his massive presence entirely dominating the small space. "You don't understand how the world works, Cassius," Marius said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that vibrated through the metal grate. "You think the federal government is your biggest problem right now? You think 20 years in a minimum security federal camp is your punishment?" Cassius blinked, sweating profusely. What are you talking about?" "Those 3 ounces of pure narcotics you miraculously found under my seat," Marius explained slowly, deliberately, watching the color completely drain from Cassius's face. "The ones you stole from your own precinct's evidence locker to frame me. Did you even bother to check whose product that was before you logged it out under a fake name?" Cassius's breathing hitched. It was just bust evidence from a street raid." "It wasn't a street raid," Marius corrected, his eyes gleaming with a dark, terrifying intelligence. "My attorney, Miss Montclair, is very thorough. While filing her motions this morning, she accidentally left the unredacted chain of custody report regarding those specific narcotics entirely unsealed on the public court docket, a docket that is routinely scraped by very interested, very violent third parties." Marius paused, letting the silence hang like a guillotine blade. That product belonged to the local distribution arm of the Sinaloa cartel, Cassius. You filed a fraudulent report claiming you destroyed their product in the incinerator 3 years ago. But today, the entire world learned that you didn't destroy it. You stole it, you kept it, and you used their highly valuable, pure product to frame a civilian for a zoning dispute. Cassius stumbled backward, his legs giving out completely. He hit the metal bench, his chest heaving as if he couldn't pull any oxygen into his lungs. The cartel didn't care about federal indictments. The cartel cared about theft, disrespect, and corrupt cops holding out on them. The feds can put you in protective custody, Cassius, Marius whispered, his voice the final nail in the coffin. But the people you stole from have eyes inside every prison in this country. You didn't just ruin your career today. You signed your own death warrant. The karma you earned didn't come from me. It came from your own greed. Marius didn't wait for a response. He turned his back on the weeping, hyperventilating corrupt cop and walked down the long, brightly lit corridor toward the exit. The heavy, reinforced steel doors of the courthouse swung open, and Marius Ravensworth stepped out into the warm, golden light of the late afternoon sun, a free man ready to return to his family. The predators had been utterly consumed by the very traps they had set. The collapse of Theodora Montrose's empire was swift, but cutting off the head of the snake often causes violent spasms. As FBI teams battered down Theodora's doors, her head of security, Vance, slipped through a concealed egress panel. A disgraced former military contractor, Vance wasn't going down with a sinking ship. But Marina's hack had frozen his offshore payroll accounts. He was broke, desperate, and hunted. He needed Marina's decryption keys to reclaim his millions. Since Marina was under federal protection, Vance targeted the one vulnerability that could force Marius Ravensworth to cooperate: his sister, Kiara. Vance quickly rallied a desperate four-man hit squad of ex-contractors and headed for the Sweet Oak Bakery. Miles away, oblivious to the approaching nightmare, peace had settled over the bakery. Marius, trading his county orange for civilian clothes, stood behind the counter as Kiara joyously iced cupcakes. Bryn sat nearby, scrolling through the explosive news of the Oak Creek cleansing. Cassius is singing, and the FBI is seizing everything, Bryn chuckled. Marius nodded, wiping the espresso machine. It's a start, but cornered rats bite. Just as Kiara laughed, tossing a pinch of flour at her brother, the world plunged into suffocating darkness. The refrigerators died, the music cut out, and the streetlights flickered off. It was a coordinated, tactical grid severance. Bryn, get down, Marius ordered, his voice instantly dropping to a lethal whisper. He guided Kiara flawlessly through the pitch-black kitchen. Hostiles. Get in the walk-in freezer and lock it from the inside. He shoved her in, hearing the heavy latch click. Marius stood alone in the dark kitchen. He had no armor and no weapons. But as the heavy steel back door began to screech against a hydraulic breaching tool, Marius breathed out slowly. The darkness was his oldest ally. The reinforced back door gave way with a sickening crunch. 4 massive figures breached, their night vision goggles painting the room in a faint green glow. Clear the kitchen. Neutralize the seal, Vance growled over his comms. Marius was clinging to the ceiling, wedged between the reinforced wooden beams above the ovens. He knew night vision stripped peripheral vision and depth perception. Letting his bare eyes adjust to the dark, he tracked their silhouettes and dropped in absolute silence. He fell like an anvil onto the point man, driving his knees into the mercenary's shoulders with a bone-shattering crack. Instantly locking in a blood choke, Marius rendered the thrashing man unconscious before he could even squeeze the trigger. Echo 2, report. Vance crackled. Marius moved with liquid grace, grabbing a 50-pound sack of baking flour. As the second mercenary rounded the dry storage racks, Marius hurled the sack at his chest. The impact burst the paper, filling the narrow aisle with a thick cloud of white dust. The mercenary's NVGs flared out into useless static. Blinded and panicking, the man fired wildly into the ceiling before Marius redirected his barrel upward and delivered a devastating open palm strike to his throat. 2 down. Vance and his last man, a wiry former ranger, stood back to back, panic replacing their arrogance. Light it up, Vance roared. As the ranger reached for his strobe light, Marius executed his trap. He had quietly opened the pressurized gas valve on the commercial stovetop. Crouching behind a steel prep island, Marius hurled a heavy cast-iron skillet at the stove's steel backsplash. The spark ignited the natural gas with a deafening whoosh. A brilliant fireball superheated the air, completely overloading the mercenaries' night vision and searing their retinas. In the chaotic aftermath, Marius vaulted the island, tackling the ranger into a stainless steel refrigerator and knocking him cold. Only Vance remained. Blinded, soot-covered, and furious, Vance drew a heavy combat knife and lunged wildly. Marius easily stepped inside the guard, redirecting Vance's massive kinetic momentum into a flawless judo throw. Vance crashed to the tiles, the knife skittering away. Marius pinned him with a knee to the sternum and delivered a single, calculated punch to Vance's jaw. The bone fractured with a sickening snap, and Vance went limp. Marius stood up amidst the wreckage, took a deep breath, and knocked on the freezer door. "It's clear, Kiki. The trash has been taken out." Flashing red and blue lights illuminated the bakery as the FBI secured the bleeding, zip-tied mercenaries. Callista surveyed the carnage with disbelief. "You took down a heavily armed Black Ops hit squad in total darkness with flour and a skillet," Callista marveled. 3 minutes for a tactical team is an eternity when someone is hunting your family," Marius replied calmly, his grazed knuckles bandaged by Kiara. Vance's arrest is the final nail in Theodora's coffin. While Marius found his peace, the universe balanced the scales for the architects of his suffering. 40 miles away, Theodora Montrose was experiencing a total psychological collapse. Stripped of her silk suits and forced into a scratchy federal jumpsuit, she sat in a barren concrete cell. Thanks to Marina's digital execution, her untouchable wealth was gone. "Do you know who I am?" she shrieked at a passing guard. "I own this city." The guard laughed. "You own a 6x8 cell. Your money is gone, and the governor disowned you. Get used to the concrete." Meanwhile, in the high-risk wing of the county lockup, Officer Cassius sat shivering, hoping his cooperation with the feds would save him. A guard a man Cassius used to mercilessly bully walked up to his cell. But instead of transfer paperwork, the guard manually disengaged the electronic lock, dropped his radio, and walked away. Cassius was alone. Then, the shadows moved. 3 heavily tattooed inmates in cartel colors stepped into the open cell. "The bosses down south say hello," one whispered, gripping a sharpened shank. "They don't like it when cops steal their product to frame civilians." Cassius opened his mouth to scream, realizing he had burned every bridge. There was no one left to rescue him. The heavy doors muffled the sounds of ultimate, undeniable retribution. 6 months later, the sun shone brightly over the grand reopening of the Sweet Oak Bakery. The line stretched around the block, drawn by Kiera's legendary pastries and the family symbol of resilience. Inside, Bryn and Callista laughed over espresso, their alliance now a deep friendship. Marius stood quietly by the window, watching his sister thrive. He took a deep breath, the warmth of the sun on his face. He had survived the darkest corners of the globe, and he had survived the corrupt shadows of his own city. He wasn't a ghost anymore. He was a guardian who had finally found his home. If this story of intense justice, relentless tactical action, and highly satisfying karma kept you on the absolute edge of your seat, smash that like button right now. Don't forget to share this incredible story of a Navy SEAL defending his family against systemic corruption with your friends. And hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss another explosive, deeply satisfying thriller on our channel. Drop a comment below and let us know which moment of pure, unforgiving karma was your absolute favorite. Until next time, stay vigilant and stay strong.